The house smelled like tea and old books. Morning light came in soft and thin through curtains that had seen 2 wars, 2 weddings, and 100 breakfasts. Pictures leaned on mantels. On one of them a woman smiled with the ease of someone who'd always been certain the house would stand after her. She was gone now. The house remained, a museum of small lives. The dent in the banister from a careless childhood, the curtain that never quite matched the wallpaper, the bowl on the side table where coins and old notes gathered like little stubborn regrets. My grandfather, Ivan Petrovich, though everyone called him simply Grandpa, had a way of moving through that house as if he were its heartbeat. He had lived in that crooked place longer than either of us had been properly alive in it. His days ran to the rhythm of the coffee pot, the radio, and the careful folding of newspapers into neat stacks. He kept his socks in the same drawer had kept his father's watch in. If the walls could talk, they would speak in his voice. On that morning the kitchen table had a nothing on it, a heavy white envelope, the kind with a registry sticker, the kind people use when they need paper to look official. Grandpa found it first, his fingers going to it with the same precision he used to steady a chess piece. There was no name, no handwriting he recognized. He frowned, and that was enough to wake me. I could hear his socks on the floorboards, the measured creak that meant he had something weighing on him. I think I saw the contract before he did. I was still half asleep. Sleep leaves a coating on your eyes that makes the world soft and forgiving. But the paper cut through that softness like a nail. Contract, sale, signatures, the house, our house, underlined, stamped, and dated. Grandpa, I said, and my voice in the kitchen sounded like it swallowed glass. He didn't speak right away. His hand trembled when he slid the contract across the table, and it was the first time I'd seen him look like a man close to being broken. The ink on the page was clean. The buyer's name was unfamiliar, a company with a glossy name, a logo that suggested glass and angles and little less soul than the house deserved. At the bottom, the signature looked like my father's. No, Grandpa said slowly, the syllable a small stone in the palm of his mouth. That's his. He shouldn't have. He never told me. My father, Sergei, had always been a practical man, the sort of son who smiled when he couldn't fix something and pretended it was nothing. He had lived in a different city for years. Had called once a month with a steady voice and a reason for every absence. But we had thought, always, that he respected the house. He had grown up here. He had seen my grandmother patch the roof in the spring and braid the curtains in the fall. The house was the memory of someone who had taught him to whistle while stoking a stove. The paper on the table said otherwise. We found other things over the next few hours. Emails printed and taped together, bank transfer screenshots, a deposit confirmation. The final sale was scheduled for the end of the month. The beer had already paid half. There was a notary's name, a time, a place. You signed? Grandpa asked finally, though his voice barely rose above the kettle. My throat tightened. I don't know. We both knew the answer. There was a way a man moves his name across paper, with loops and weight and a signature you can feel in your mouth. I had seen my father sign other papers, bank forms, hospital slips, the kind of small betrayals that hide under routine. This signature looked right. He can't, Grandpa said. He can't do this to us. He spoke like a man reading a page of a book he'd once loved and suddenly found obscene. I wanted to scream. Instead we made a plan, the sort of plan born from desperation and love. First, we had to be sure. Sometimes things could be mistaken. People could forge. Notarizations could be flawed. There were always loopholes in paper. Grandpa called a lawyer he'd known in better days, a lean, grave woman named Olga who smelled faintly of herbs and who had a drawer full of old cases she'd never stopped caring about. She listened, asked 3 short questions, and said, "Don't sign anything. Don't let them in the house. Oh, come by." Olga arrived and moved through the house like a wind through old pages. She looked at the deed, the registry number. She checked dates and stamps and phone numbers. Her eyes, behind glasses that made her face look more like a pair of binoculars, flicked from page to page. This could be valid, she said, but it would depend on signatures and consent. If this house is co-owned, and if there's a minor shareholder. She paused, considering. I'm not a legal scholar, but Grandpa and I had a shared sense, like a sixth sense, that the house wasn't simply property. It was also legacy, and sometimes legacy has legal teeth. You have to understand. Grandma had died when I was small. She and Grandpa had been married a long time, and the house had been in their name. When Grandpa's son, my father, had left the town, had gotten a piece of paper in a rush, a small slice of ownership as part of some family arrangement. I, as a minor, Might have had a stake on paper too small, perhaps, but it could be enough. Olga told us to find everything: original deeds, old photos with stamps on the back, anything that proved our presence in the house across seasons and years. We began to dig. The attic gave up boxes of ration cards, an envelope of small receipts, a half-burnt postcard with my grandmother's handwriting in slanted ink. In a tin under the floorboards we found the original deed, yellowed, creased, with the elder clerk's stamp in a corner. The signature there was my grandfather's, like a promise. Next to it, in a different hand and from a different decade, a younger man, my father, had scribbled his name in a lighter ink, on a line that seemed almost ceremonial. The paper in the tin proved something deeper. The house had been held in trust. There were conditions written in old language, conditions no one had thought to read for years. When Grandpa read them aloud, he sounded lost in the past. If the house is to be sold, all heirs must consent, he said. And a sale that affects a minor's interest must have a court review. The law was not glamorous. It was a cold ladder of clauses and footnotes. But it was something, and sometimes that something was the only thing standing between a memory and a marketable commodity. We had ours. The beer had scheduled the final signing. If money had already been transferred, the beer expected to own the land, the wood, the crooked door that stuck in winter. And my father, whether from greed, weakness, or sheer resignation to the idea that had solved his debts, had put his name on that paper and tried to put the rest of us behind him. Grandpa and I decided not to confront him first. There's a certain kind of confrontation that's private and sheepish, and there's a different kind that makes a man hear his name in the mouths of others. We chose the latter. If he'd forged consent, he'd be forced to answer under light and not in the murk of his own excuses. The plan was messy and simple at the same time. We'd expose the sale in the most public place available, the community meeting at the town hall. If the beer was a company, they would be embarrassed to find the trust of their investment questioned in front of neighbors. If my father had used forged documents, the risk of public shame would be greater than the quick cash he had in mind. We made leaflets. Grandpa's handwriting, which had steadied over the years with the patience of a man who'd carved furniture and carved a life, looked dignified on thin paper. Our house sold without consent. One read: "Come to town hall tonight. Bring records. Bring questions." I didn't know if anyone would come. The town had shrunk. The school had fewer children. The shops closed earlier, and new faces arrived with business cards and left with briefcases. But people still argued at the market over eggs. People still remembered my grandmother's pies. We put the leaflets in mailboxes and stuck them to lampposts. When we arrived at the town hall that evening, the room smelled of lemon cleaner and old carpets. Fluorescent lights hummed over rows of chairs. Neighbors filled seats with an air of curiosity that felt almost sacred. They came with coats buttoned and faces warmed by the idea of being needed. I saw faces I'd known since birth: the woman from the bakery who would hand me a slice of cake when I was small, the electrician who knew the house's creaky wiring better than the builder's plans, the two old men who met whenever something civic needed a verdict. We weren't just two people asking for attention. We were a story and a stain. The leaflet did what it needed to do. It made people interested in a thing that sounded like a betrayal. Grandpa stood at the front. He wore his old wool coat, the one with a hole in the elbow that had become part of its character. He looked smaller on the stage than I expected. When he began to speak, the hall held its breath. "My name is Ivan," he said. His voice didn't shake then. There was a decades-long steadiness in it, the kind that comes from carrying loss and knowing how to go on. "This house has been in my family for 3 generations. My wife raised our children here. My grandson here remembers every winter on the top step. This house," he stopped, and the word felt like a bell, "is not just wood and nails. It is memory." He laid the contract on the table like a challenge. The murmurs rose in a wave that made the room feel warmer. Someone gasped when they saw the developer's logo. Someone hissed the word "sold" like a knife. I watched my father walk in. He arrived late, hair combed, suit as if he'd come from a boardroom. Had changed, somehow, since I'd last seen him. He carried a leather folder and a small, forced smile. When the people around him recognized his name on the document, there was a sudden shift. Conversation sharpened. People who had known us for years looked between him and Grandpa like judges measuring which of 2 stories held more truth. "Dad," I said before thinking. The word felt small in the big room. He paused, a flicker of something passing over his face, recognition at first, then surprise, then the steadying of a man who'd planned for this outcome. He set his folder down with the care of someone who wanted to control the scene. Sergey, Grandpa said, without anger yet a kind of measured sorrow that had the weight of a verdict. You sold the house? The room listened. Someone in the back muttered about markets and property, someone else about rents and the difficulty of keeping land in a changing world. My father's voice came out soft at first. I did what I had to do, he said. Debts. Business. It was the only option. A woman from the bakery, Tamara, stood up. She crossed her arms the way people do when they prepare to weather a storm. You sold it with whose consent? She demanded. My father's jaw worked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He took out his folder and produced a notary's stamp, neat papers, photocopies. He spoke of signatures and obligations and how the money would be used to stabilize his family, to pay off debts that threatened to make us homeless anyway. He used the language of necessity. He looked around the room, as if pleading for understanding. Why didn't you tell us? Grandpa asked. It was not an accusation. It was a small, bitter pleading for the world to be simple again. I tried. I called. I left messages. You never answered. It sounded rehearsed. There was a beat where I wanted to believe him. Maybe there had been attempts, maybe pride or poor phone service had kept us apart. But the documents we had found, the bank confirmations, the email chains that showed rapid negotiation and a deliberate haste, told another story. That's when Olga did something small and elegant. She stood and asked to look at everything. She checked the contract, cross-checked registry numbers, and then she asked a question that made some people shift in their seats. Where is the actual consent of all heirs? And where is the court review for the minor's interest? There was a pause. My father's papers were glossy, but they didn't have everything. There was a dependence on the idea that because one adult signed, the house transferred. Olga's presence made the bureaucracy visible. Her knowledge turned loose papers into a net. The beer, who was in the hall, a man with a neat haircut and the tired smile of someone who deals in plans, grew nervous when told that a sale involving a minor's interest required a court's review. You can't just sign away someone else's stake, Olga said plainly. There are procedures. If those procedures weren't followed, the sale can be declared void. I watched that man's face gradually change. He had already put the money down. For him, the house was a clear ledger entry. If something in the ledger was wrong, it meant potential loss. People who speculate in buildings don't like public risk. What changed the tenor of the night more than any argument was a simple piece of paper Grandma had tucked into the seam of a cookbook half a lifetime ago, a small, ink-smudged will that mentioned the house, my father, and the order of succession. It wasn't big on legalese, but it had a human clarity that the boardroom papers lacked. It said, in my grandmother's hand, this house shall remain the home of our children and the memory of those who lived here. If sold, it must be done with full consent and honor. There's something about handwriting that strips formalities bare. People in the hall read that page like a map. The developer's representative shifted from a cardboard smile to a thin-lipped calculation. But the most damning evidence wasn't an old will. It was a short video we had recorded in the attic 2 nights earlier, not to trap someone, not to shame, but to keep a record. It set up my phone on a shelf and left it rolling. It thought maybe the footage would be useful if there were any questions about the house's contents. I hadn't expected to find what we did. On the video, my father moves through the hallways at dusk. He talks on the phone and laughs in a way that sounded relieved. He opens drawers, flips the family album like someone tasting the pages, and then he pulls out a box. He speaks into the phone about a number and a wire transfer. Will be done by Friday. They already signed. They're buying it cheap, but it'll be quick. Half now, half on closing. He says my name on the call with a casualness that made my stomach drop. They won't care about the boy's share, he says. The minor won't know. And even if he does, it's a small claim. When I played that video in the hall, there were audible gasps. My father's face changed color like someone went and poured cold water over it. He tried to explain, to say the word desperation like a shield. He spoke of debts, of threats from men who had called and used words that made him bristle. He told stories of calls at odd hours, of invoices that had to be paid. He framed himself not as a villain but as a man forced into making a gamble. I could see it in his eyes. He had believed the gamble would solve everything. He had believed he could carry the shame of an act if the shame brought money. But there was another kind of arithmetic in that room that night, the ledger of trust. The neighbors counted their own debts and then counted the cost of losing a place where holidays had spilled over and children had learned to ride bikes. The town was small enough that someone could still remember the baby teeth lost in the yard. That memory became currency. After hours of voices, Olga spoke softly but clearly. Legally, she said, the sale is questionable. Practically, it would be a nightmare to enforce given the procedural flaws. If you pursue this in court, you risk not only the sale but heavy sanctions for anyone who attempted to sell without proper consent. That was the hinge. De Beer, suddenly conscious of legal risk and public scrutiny, decided that losing money was small compared to losing reputation. His representatives withdrew the finalization until the courts were satisfied. That was how my father's paper fell apart, not because he was a bad man, necessarily, but because the world had leaned on profit. Quick transactions, neat transfers, did not account for the messy dignity of a house rooted in people's lives. My father left that night with a face older than his years. The town watched him go. He had money in his bank account because De Beer had wired a deposit. But the legal apparatus had stalled, and so had the plan. After the meeting, there was no cinematic apology. There was only the slow, terrible work of repair. He came to the house the next afternoon with an envelope. Inside was a pile of crumpled bills. He offered them with hands that shook. "I was going to use this to cover everything," he said, "to make it right." Grandpa looked at the money the way a man might look at a spilled glass of drink. "Money can't pour time back," he said. "You thought you could fix everything by wiping a signature. You thought the house was a ledger." My father's shoulders sagged. "I thought I could protect you," he said. "I am sorry. I thought the town would understand." There were private things said in that kitchen, things you can't put into public record without losing their sharp edges. There were truths I learned about my father that night, how debt had grown like a mold in the walls of his life, how pride had built a barricade around him so he wouldn't ask for help. He had, in his mind, created a plan that would save everyone with a quick, cruel solution. In his mind, had done what was necessary. He had also done what was wrong. In the following months, De Beer, not wanting the trouble, withdrew entirely. The deposit was returned. The registry flagged the attempted sale as under review. My father took on odd jobs in his city. He wrote long letters to Grandpa and me, each line tending toward apology and the slow, patient business of making amends. It didn't erase what happened. It didn't instantly knit the rent of trust that had torn. The town had seen the exchange. People have memories longer than we like. My father's name had been associated with betrayal in a market where a reputation is often all a man has. But the house remained ours. We painted one wall a bright, defiant blue that spring. We mended the roof, and the new shingles made a sound like rain when the weather ran through. Grandpa planted a sapling near the gate and said he wanted to see it grow into something my father could sit under when he visited. My father, eventually, did sit under it with shame and with apologies that were not smooth enough, but they were present. Years later, when I tell this story on camera or in a cafe to someone who listens, the point people ask me about most is justice. What did we make him pay? Did we make him pay enough? We made him pay the hard price, the knowledge that his action would not quietly be swallowed. We made him pay with the things he had tried to ignore: shame, the need to work, and the slow chore of regaining trust. We didn't bankrupt him, and we didn't exile him. We gave him back what he could earn without destroying himself, a path that required time and honesty instead of quick folding of cash. And there was a lesson that stuck to me like a scent. Money can replace things, but rarely the meaning behind them. People who treat houses as assets sometimes forget they are also repositories of small, stubborn truths: a window with a mark where a child once drew sun, a cupboard with a dent from a dropped pan, a chair with a worn arm from daily leaning. Those little scars are not commodities. They are vows Grandpa lived on. He taught me to sand the old table legs and to listen when someone said they were sorry. He laughed more in the later years, as if some of the weight had been taken off. He would sometimes sit me on his knee and tell me about my grandmother, about how she used to patch the curtains and read aloud until the light left the room. He gave me a recipe for her porridge and the old wooden spoon that had a chip in it like a wink. My father came around sometimes. We didn't move back to the same rhythms immediately. Trust, once cracked, needs patient hands and clear days to heal. But he was part of our life again in a way that didn't let him be the man who solved everything with one crossing out. As for me, I learned how fragile the things we take for granted could be and how fierce a family becomes when memory is threatened. I learned that a house is not only the place you sleep, it's the ledger where names are kept, where small signatures mean more than money ever will. Sometimes at night I sit by the window of that blue-walled room and imagine the future that would try to buy our past. I think of the sapling planted near the gate, now a young tree, and of the sound it makes in the wind. I think of the little domestic things that define us, and I think of the line Grandpa said at the end, when the world had quieted and the arguments had been spent. If you trade your people for paper, he said, voice low and plain, the paper will never keep you warm. We had made my father pay in what mattered, and in doing so, we had preserved the house, the crooked, stubborn heart of our family, from becoming the sterile prize of someone else's profit. That was our victory, not a loud triumphant scene, but the slow, steady work of keeping memory alive when someone thought it might be easier to sell it away. The house still creaks. The kettle still makes a small, familiar song. The photos still hang, and sometimes, late at night, I catch Grandpa humming a tune and my father listening at the doorway, not sure whether to enter. They both stand there, different men, learning, slowly, to occupy the same space again. And that, I suppose, was the true revenge, not ruination, not public shaming, but the reclaiming of what was ours, the past, the right to remember, and the quiet insistence that some things are not for sale.